We interview people from across Australia in the footprint of more than 250 Indigenous nations. We recognise and deeply respect our First Nations people, their heritage, cultural beliefs, and close relationship with the land on which we walk, drive, or fly over.
And so I went to get my phone and I hear this, "Mummy, come look at Darcy." I found Darcy underneath our bedroom window, blue and frothing at the mouth.
Just turn around as quickly as we can.
That blood pressure is not coming up.
Unload the patient.
Is it a big property?
Still breathing okay at the moment.
On a 493, understood, thank you. Put the stretcher back in, shut the door, off we go again.
This is the Flying Doctor podcast, and I'm your host, Lana Howarth. Each week we fly to rural and remote communities across Australia and hear the stories of real-life patients who've needed a call on the Royal Flying Doctor service. Kate Mitchell and her husband Matt have 3 children, and in 2022 they were living in Narrikup, southeast of Albany in Western Australia. Mobile phone coverage in metro and regional areas is generally okay, but the connectivity across rural and remote areas of Australia can be patchy, shonky, or non-existent. And there's no time like a family emergency for a connection to emergency services to be so important. Kate's here to chat with me about a family emergency that turned their life upside down and relied on telecoms.
This podcast has been made possible with the support of Isuzu Ute Australia, a major national partner of the Royal Flying Doctor Service and also the sponsor of the Flying Doctor podcast series.
Hello, Kate.
Hi, Lana.
Tell me first of all, Kate, before we dive into the crisis that sort of shaped and defined your family over recent years, where did you grow up?
I was so fortunate. I grew up in Hyden in Western Australia. It's right in between Perth and Esperance would be the easiest way to describe it. At one point, it was wheat and sheep farm, so 55 k's east of Hyden, which is very well known for Waybrook. And I was the eldest of 3 children. My grandpa cleared our farm, and it was a magical childhood that, you only hope you could give your kids the same.
Oh, wow. So you're a farm kid through and through.
Yeah, middle of nowhere. So we actually had the rabbit-proof fence run through our property. And as I said, Grandpa had cleared that, and my grandma and grandpa had built the farmhouses out there. And my dad was the youngest of 4 boys.
So it's a big extended family. And so how did you come to meet your now husband, Matt?
So I'm a health and phys ed teacher, and I loved playing tennis. I played a lot of tennis, and I dislocated my shoulder. And not long before that, I'd actually had ankle surgery. And so for a phys ed teacher to be out of action for such long periods would not be ideal. So for my grandpa's 80th birthday, we played lawn bowls at his party. And my dad plays lawn bowls and my mum. And so I was like, you know what, there must be a bit to this lawn bowls game. And so one school holidays, I went down to my local bowls club and I loved it. And I loved it so much that I then started to play. It was pretty risk-free of injury for someone who obviously had a pretty rough...
Somebody with a shonky shoulder and a shonky ankle. Yep.
It had a couple of surgeries, too many. And I met Matt at the Bowls WA Awards night, and he wouldn't leave me alone. So that was it. After that, we hit it off. We now have a family of lawn bowlers. Our youngest son, that's all he wants to do is go to the lawn bowls club, which is a bit of a concern. But yeah, it's a very different way to meet your husband, but obviously very fortunate.
Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. Well, I have one side of my family is big into croquet in a similar way to the way your family's into bowls, And so I've got lots of very fond memories of my children growing up with all of us out on a croquet lawn trying to figure out how to get the ball to go through the little hoops.
Yeah, I've never actually played. It would be super interesting.
It's very similar to bowls in that you really do require very fine eye and hand-eye coordination.
And I think the higher levels you play, the more tricky it is. So I think for some you might be like, yeah, you have to get close to the kitty, but it's actually at those other levels, it's a great game, strategic wise as well. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So how did you end up in Narrackup then?
Yeah, so Matt's family, they had farms at Wellstead and Jerramunga, which is just out of Albany. And his father, Ross, sold them when the boys were teenagers, and they had a property in near Albany. And for us, when Harry, who's our middle child, was 8 weeks old, Ross was like, I'm going to sell it, or you can come down here. So very quickly, we packed up all of our belongings with a young 3-year-old and a 8-week-old, and loaded the car, and then came back to the Great Southern, because as I said earlier, it's something that it's priceless, bringing your children up in the countryside and giving them those opportunities that we had as kids and the sense of community. So it was an easy decision for us. So yeah, we packed up, came to Albany, and that's how we ended up really farming. So
Wow.
we actually lived in town before we moved out to our farm at Narrackup. That was our resting place. That's where I thought I was going to die. Very scenic, overlooking the Porongarups and the ranges, and it's such a beautiful place. But yeah, really it was just that decision to bring our kids up, how we grew up.
And what does Matt do for a profession?
So Matt is a roof plumber by trade. He would like to say that he's a professional lawn bowler, but that is not the case. But yeah, he's a roof plumber by trade. But as I said, we both grew up on family farms. And so very different to home where I grew up. Ross was predominantly sheep, so there wasn't in terms of much cropping. So it was very different and different conditions to where I grew up as
Yeah.
well.
How have your kids taken to being on the land as they were growing up in that space? Did they enjoy the freedom and the broad horizons and everything, the mud and everything that goes with it?
Yeah, there's always those classic photos that you've got of the kids naked running around and causing mischief and picking up rocks. And I think it was about everything that you did out there you could do as a family. And I think that was really special. So whether it's chasing or drenching, everybody has a role to play, but you get to spend that time together. And I think that that's one thing that you can take for granted. It allows the flexibility. Yes, it's a job, and yes, it can be really tough, but it's something that you can all do together. And the kids learn really quickly and they pick up on things, whether it's in the shearing shed and they're trying to be a rousey, they can't get in the way. But, it's an environment in which the kids can learn and they can practice their fine and gross motor skills and all of those types of things. Yeah, they loved it. Grace especially. So our kids have dyslexia, so there's obviously some learning difficulties there as well. So for them to get out and about and be practical and hands-on, they love it. Yeah.
Now, let's go back to 2022 when things went a little haywire. Would you tell me about that day? Like, what had you been doing with the family and where was everybody on that day?
Yeah, so Matt came into town to work, funnily enough, that day. So he was plumbing. And I was actually winning at mum life, which with 3 young kids wouldn't be very often that I could say that I was doing a great job. But Grace was on the bus very early. We were on time. Ross, my father-in-law, always was coming out the farm to help. And so he and I had a plan to drench sheep. Now, Ross is an early bird, and he would be up at the crack of dawn out there, sheep in the pen, and you would be running around trying to make sure that you were there on time. However, this particular day, I was that good that I was already on the bike with the boys. So Harry would have been 3 and Darcy was around 16 months to 18 months. And so we had got the ewes in and Ross rocked up. And so we did our first mob. Darcy had been a little unwell, a little snotty, but nothing that would think something was going to happen. Bit irritable, but yeah, not too bad, just like he was a bit tired. And so we'd done the first mob of ewes and it got to about 10 o'clock and it's a good time for a 16-month-old to have a nap, but it's also a really good time for smoko. So we went up the house, opened the door. I tried to give the boys, we made a cup of tea. I tried to give the boys something to eat, some fruit and a muffin. Darcy really didn't want to have a bar of that. And I was like, you're going to have a nap. And so he climbed down off me and he went to play with Harry. And we actually had a little kitten that we got from Wagen. He was a feral farm cat, but he was our lovable Felix. And Felix was a kitten underneath our bed. And the boys were in our bedroom trying to get the kitten out using the broom.
Poor kitten.
I know, the poor kitten. He is still very, very friendly.
Despite being prodded by a broomstick.
Yeah, prodded by a broomstick by these young boys. And, most of the time boys could be in the bedroom doing something very silly like jumping on the bed and mucking around. But that's what they were trying to do, trying to get Felix out from under the bed. And like any good phys ed teacher, farmer, I have multiple weather apps on my phone. I think I'm up to about 4. And it was hot. And so I remember going to Ross, let's just check the weather for tomorrow and we'll make a plan of how many mobs we'll do tomorrow. And so I went to get my phone and I hear this, mummy, come look at Darcy. And most of the time I knew the boys were being silly, that I'd be like, yeah, I'll be there in a minute, mate. Like I'll be there in a sec. But I actually went directly there that day, which was very lucky because, yes, the broom was on the ground and there was a few stools lying around. But I found Darcy underneath our bedroom window, blue and frothing at the mouth. So I said to Harry very quickly, Harry, what had happened? And he couldn't tell me. And it was really that fright or flight that occurred. So I asked Harry what had happened. He couldn't tell me. I scooped him up, as in scooped Darcy up, took him into the kitchen. I said, Ross, call an ambulance. Ross at this point was in shock, which I think would be a pretty common reaction to the situation that we were in.
So you said that he was blue. So he was lifeless. He was unresponsive.
To me, he looked like he was dead. Yeah.
Right.
He was obviously lost a lot of oxygen, had no colour, blue, pale, lifeless. I thought he was dead.
That's horrible. Okay, so you put him on the table.
Yeah, so I scooped him up and I put him on the kitchen floors, on the tiles. I started CPR and then all of these things ran through my head. What happens if he fell? What happens if he choked on something? And the farmhouse floors were always pretty grotty with 3 young kids running through and never taking their boots off. And I knew that the day before that I had mopped all of the floors and I had vacuumed, and I'm not a risk taker. And so the kids didn't have Lego for a long time. There's no small bits around, but you never know. Kids are very savvy. But I knew in my head that there wasn't much around that he may have choked on. But I had that in the back of my head. So I grabbed him and I did multiple black blows and nothing really happened. So I rolled him back over and I started CPR again. It felt like forever. And I couldn't give you a time frame. That's all a bit blurry. But he started to get a bit of pinkness back in his cheek. Very, very drowsy, no talking. It's not as if he was able to communicate with me. He was floppy, lethargic.
Was he breathing on his own? Did he start to breathe on his own?
He started, but it was very faint. Like it could have gone either way, I think. It was very fine line. So he had colour, so I knew that he was getting oxygen.
Yeah.
If I squeezed his ear, I would get a whimper, like a little bit of a whimper. And so I knew that he was obviously getting the oxygen that he required in comparison to the way that I found him.
Was this the first time you'd ever had to do CPR? Because I know a lot of us get trained on CPR, but many don't ever have to fall on it. So was this for you the first time you'd had to do it?
We'd had a few situations, which is not ironic, but at the bowls club where people have needed assistance. I started off marketing the sport so well. And fortunately enough, I had a success story last time. We had a guy that had a stroke and everyone was amazing and jumped in and did the right thing there. It was just obviously we all had our jobs to do, so I called an ambulance. Growing up where I did, you would come across car accidents quite often, but a lot of the time a truckie might get there the same time that you did, and being a young female at the time, they were the ones that went to that scenario. I think in your job as a health and phys ed teacher, you need to train quite regularly. So you teach it in your curriculum, especially when they get to year 9 and 10 and outdoor ed. And then when you do your surf rescues or your water qualifications, you need to do it again. And then you do your first aid. So I think now I've been an educator for 16 years and you think about that you do it, minimum twice a year and then you teach it. It's just really ingrained in your brain.
Right.
And I'm so grateful for that because it could have gone two ways. And I would hate to think that if it didn't work, the position that our family would be in now. So I try to just push that away and say that that didn't happen. I'm really thankful that I've had those experiences over the years because they were really imperative to the situation that I found myself in.
Wow. So you've got Darcy there on the table and there's a little bit of colour coming back and he's breathing just faintly.
Yep.
You said that your father-in-law, Ross, had called an ambulance. How far away was the local ambulance?
I'd asked Ross to call an ambulance. At this point, he still couldn't even locate my phone. I think he was just in panic stations. And then I had Harry, who was 3, eating dry Cheerios from a bowl, just staring at me. And I was like, okay. So I said to Ross, please get my phone. So Ross grabbed my phone. I called 000. I went through all of the questions that they need to ask us. And then they instructed me to stay there. There was no way that I was going to stay there and wait. We know that we were, probably over 25 Ks away from a town that would be closest to us. We're over 50 Ks away from Albany. The town close to us is volunteer, not paramedic. So a lot of the regional and rural remote towns in WA are really reliant on volunteer ambulance drivers. So in different contexts, that means that you could be waiting until someone comes from their farm into town, get changed, get the ambulance and come out.
Right.
Mount Barker at volleys are incredible and there's a lot of long-serving ones there and they're relatively quick. But for me, I was not going to sit around and wait and see what happened. So I said to Ross, please get the ute. And then I said, Harry, hop in the ute. And Harry was very concerned that he didn't have, I was like, in the ute, like hop in. Poor Ross drove too slow and then he drove too fast because he was on the gravel and I think the ute swung out. So he had not only someone that was pretty much unconscious next to him, but he also had a very bossy mother telling him what to do.
Agitated mother who was, going to do everything she needed to do to control that situation. Hey, I am there with you, babe. I'm there 100%. Whenever you get that situation where a mother has to act to save her child, I think taking control is the right thing to do.
And it was funny because I remember arguing with the St. John's trainer when we moved to Albany. Before that in Perth, we were always taught, especially with the kids that we were in care of, that you call an ambulance and you wait and, duty of care, legal reasons. And I remember doing a course here and the guy was like, if, something's happened out in the bush and you wait, that time is so critical, unless there's a reason that's a spinal or what have you, is really, really critical that you don't waste that time. And I remember arguing with him, I really did. I was like, well, this goes against everything, that we've ever been taught or been told. And he's like, Kate. And that kind of stuck in my memory because I knew that if I waited, it was just wasted time.
I completely hear you on this. I live a good 35, 40 kilometres from the closest tertiary hospital. And if I waited for an ambulance here on my property, if there was an accident, it would be easily an hour to an hour and a half because by the time the ambulance even got here and found us, So I completely understand. It's far faster just to get in the ute and drive.
Yeah. And there's been times, after that where we've had a similar situation where we've beaten the ambulance even coming out of town. Right. So we called it. I said to her that I wasn't staying at the gate, as in the operator. I said, I'm not staying at the gate. You can tell them I'll meet the ambulance on the road. Right. And so we'd opened the farm gate, gone through onto the gravel road before we hit the bitumen. It's about 4 Ks, just under 4 Ks. And she was on the phone. As you said, I was quite agitated. They were asking me these questions, which I just thought was so stupid at the time. But I was like, I can get a noise from him by pinching his ear. And before we hit the bitumen, heading towards the ambulance, the phone cut out. And there was just no reception. So there was no reception on that 4 Ks between the farm and the bitumen. And I remember turning onto the bitumen and she was like, you can't hang up on me. You can't hang up on me. And I I was so adamant. I was like, it's not that. It's just that there's no reception. Like, I just gave it right back, as if I would hang up. It's just unfortunate that that reception isn't there when we needed it most. So hit the bitumen, got onto Albany Highway, which is like a main vein between Albany and Perth, started heading towards the ambulance. The road's really busy. There's a lot of travellers, a lot of tourists, a lot of farmers, very, very busy road. And there was a caravan in front of us. And I could tell that Ross was getting really concerned about the ambulance not being able to see us past, not being able to see us past the ambulance, not being able to see us past the caravan. And there was actually 2 police officers on the side of the road, just, having their time, doing their numbers. And I said to Ross, pull over. And I'd been in the sheep yards all day and I'd stunk, and I'd had tracky dacks on. I had a pair of socks that had holes. They weren't even the same. One was blue, one was black. And I remember holding Darcy crossing the road, and I said, you need to help me. I've given CPR to my kid. And one of them looked up at me and said, oh, did he have enough sleep last night? It's like, yes, he's had enough sleep. Like, I don't know what happened. And I knew then that I could then tell the 000 operator that I was with the police. Obviously, they stand out. They would have been able to see them. And then also, if something had happened, that I had other people that were qualified and were allowed to drive really, really fast. So I was like, this is a win-win. Like, I'm in a safety holder here until we can get the help that we need.
Does that mean then you waited there with the police, or did you get the police to escort you?
No, I waited with the police because the ambulance, they were like, just wait there with them, the ambulance. And it wasn't long after that the ambulance arrived.
Great.
The ambulance pulled up to the police. When Matt's mum and dad lived out at Wellstead, their next door neighbours were the Tylers, and they had a lot of kids same age to Matt and his brother. And Linda has been a volunteer ambulance driver for many, many, many years. Matt's mum passed away when they were in their early 20s, like their early 20s. And the ambulance pulled up, and it was Linda, Matt's childhood next door neighbour, that hopped out.
Wow.
This podcast has been made possible with the support of Isuzu Ute Australia. Have you seen any of our 7 large RFDS flight simulators as they move around Australia? Attending school, community or field days. Each is being towed by an Isuzu D-Max Ute, courtesy of Isuzu Ute Australia. Reliable vehicles are imperative in the harsh Australian outback, and the Isuzu D-Max and MUX vehicles are the perfect match for the long-distance, heavy towing demands of these simulators right across Australia. To learn more, search Isuzu Ute online.
If you believe in guardian angels, I definitely had one that day because he was okay. But I think also to hand your child over to someone when you had just experienced that would be pretty tough. But I remember saying to her, I'm only handing him to you, Linda. And by then I had broken down, but she kept me busy. She was really good in the ambulance. She gave me a job to do. And luckily enough for us is that one of those police officers was a pursuit driver. And so he goes, I'll drive the ambulance. So we had lights and sirens coming into Albany. And after the fact, everyone was like, was that you guys? Like, there were so many lights around our big roundabouts that, we had lights and sirens coming in. And then we rocked up to Albany Health Campus where they looked after us.
Now, when you arrived at Albany and the doctors got to actually see Darcy, were they able to tell you what had happened and why he had been unconscious and, blue and frothing and so forth?
No, so they couldn't actually tell us, and that's when all the testing began. They just said, you did a really good job. I was like, thanks very much. Yeah, he had so many blood tests and on so many monitors and so many machines, but we actually had no idea. So that's when the investigating started, and it was just kind of a wait and see. So he was still very, very out of it, very hard to rouse, very drowsy. He wasn't up sparking around, that's for sure. And he had a lot of monitors on him. And then it was obviously decided that we would be admitted. So we went up to the ward. And then for me, it was about navigating Harry and talking to Harry about what may have happened. So I said to Matt, when you get Harry off Ross, can you just ask him some questions and ask him what had happened? And at that point, Matt rang and he said, Harry said that Darcy did a flippy floppy fish dance. And this was the next day. And so we said to the nurses and the doctors, we think that he had a seizure. And we're like, okay. So then they were like quite common. So the stats will show definitely WA, it's like 1 in 10 will have a seizure in their lifetime and 1 in 25 will be diagnosed with epilepsy.
Wow, I didn't know that. I had no idea it was
Yeah.
that prevalent.
Yeah, so much more prevalent than what people think, especially the 1 in 10. So the 1 in 10 people will have a seizure in their lifetime. And I think it's something, if you cast your memory back, even in all those years teaching, I've seen fainting. I may have seen one very small seizure. There's 40 different seizure types that you can have. But for us, we were like, okay, cool. And it could be because he was a little bit unwell. So it could be a febrile one. They didn't seem too concerned about it. They were like, it does happen 1 in 10. And so we were like, okay then, groovy. So we were in there for a few days. They observed him. They ran all the tests. You know, his blood sugar was a bit low, but it could have been because of whatever reason. Nothing really showed. So they said, look, I think you're pretty safe. You can go home now. Very shaky to go home. Scared for the first week to be back out there. But then after the second week, we kind of found our groove and we were like, you know what, probably won't happen again. It was just a once off. So you started to settle down a little bit and then keep, doing what you do. And then things kind of went back to normal. But it wasn't very long-lived because I remember going outside to feed the chooks. But I said, come on, Darcy, we'll go back inside and we'll get the chook feed. And he cracked it. He did not want to go back inside. He had lost his nana. I went and got the feed and then he flicked back. It's like he was chucking a tantrum. So I was like, mate, come on, we're not chucking a tanty. But for us, that was a seizure in my arms. So I remember having him in my arms. He went stiff as a board and then raced outside. Matt was on the motorbike with the two big kids to close the gate or open a gate. I think they went to open a gate. I remember just screaming to try and stop him on the bike. So I put Darcy on the gravel. We'd had people there, electricians that day, putting in a filter for the water tanks, and they just would have heard me scream. Put him on the ground. I said to Grace, go get me some honey. Like I was like, maybe my dad's diabetic. I was like, maybe, it's something to do with his blood sugar levels. Threw him in the car and then we drove to our nearest emergency department. And when we got there, they observed him from 4:30 to 8:30. Matt had taken the big two kids into town to Ross's house, so into Albany. And then I said, come back and get me. And they discharged me at 8:30 and they said, sometimes these things happen for a reason and we're not quite sure. We've spoken to Albany. You're pretty safe to go home. And in my head, I was like, I am not going home. Twice now, something's happening. I've never seen it before.
How was Darcy, like, at this point?
This kid, even after that period of time where they tried to send me home, was not even stirring. So he was very agitated. I remember going to the bathroom. I was like, can you look after him while I go to the bathroom and I wait for Matt? There was no way that I would have taken this kid home. Like, he was wiped out. Not even communicating or talking or anything. So I was like, nope, like, I'm not taking him home. Matt picked me up and he said, we're going to town. I said, yep, we're going into town. But something stuck with me because there was another nurse on with us and there was only 2 beds in there. The other nurse said to me whilst we were waiting, while they were observing him, if he has one more seizure, he'll be diagnosed with epilepsy. And I was like, oh, yeah. But it kind of stuck with me because when we left, I said to Matt, I'm not going home. We're going into Albany. And I remember going to Ross's house in town and I sat out in the car with Darcy. By this point, he was still in his car seat. And Matt said, what are we going to do? And I said, go inside and check on the kids and let me make a couple of phone calls. One of the girls that was a bit older than me out in Hyden, Sari Maritz, she was a nurse, but she's now an emergency doctor. And I remember calling Suz and saying, what do you reckon? And she goes, it doesn't sound right. I would take him up back to emergency in Albany. I said, okay. And her husband's an anaesthetist and they were like, don't be afraid, just take him. Like, something's not adding up. And then another friend, Amelia, is a paediatric nurse who actually worked at the hospital at the time, and I rang her. She was in a P&F meeting. She called me back. And she said, nah, just take him. And I said, all right. So I took him back up the hospital, and we were so fortunate. We had a great nurse and great doctors there. And the doctor that was on that evening, I know socially, and she goes, Kate, this story isn't adding up. Something's not adding up. At this point, it was rather late at night, and Darcy was back to his boisterous self. So he was running around like a maniac, and he had cheese and crackers, and he was being his ever charming self to the nurses. And they were like, we'll put you on a ward, we'll admit you. So we went upstairs, went on the ward, and the next day I was like, I just need another shower. These things always happen when, you've been farming and you're all dirty. And I was like, right. So I remember saying to Darcy, go to the bathroom and then I'll give you a shower. So he went, and I actually found him in the toilet just throwing toilet paper in his toilet. I was like, mate, not the place to do it. Let's not do that. So I said, I'll go to the bathroom. I sat down on the toilet and he was walking. I was like, wash your hands. And it looked like he just smacked into the basin. However, here we went again with another episode of whatever was happening.
Wow. So he face planted into the basin.
Yeah, well, it looked like that's what he'd done, but he actually had started having a seizure. So he just went stiff as a board. So I ran and I picked him up and I went into the corridor, and my dad's name's Mark, and there was a nurse whose name was Mark, one of the only male nurses up there. It's now Chris, but there's Mark. And I remember just screaming for Mark. I just held him and I screamed for Mark. And there was this old lady on this particular ward. There is a lot of elderly patients and then paediatric patients. And this old lady up the end just stared at me because I was just screaming. Mark came, grabbed Darcy, put him on the bed, and then they said, well, they pressed the button, all the emergency buttons. So the emergency doctors from downstairs came up that particular day. And then I sat outside. I didn't want to be in there. I'd seen it enough. I felt like I had dealt with this multiple times by myself now. And so I just let them do their thing. So they got me a chair and I sat outside the room, and there was about 4 nurses surrounding me, and you could tell that they were scared. Like, I was in shock at this point, and I just didn't know what was happening, and it was just a nightmare, really. And they said to me, you need to call your husband. You need to call your husband now. And then I was like, we're in a fair bit of trouble, like if they 7 o'clock in the morning and they want Matt. And I said, my phone's in there and I'm not going in there because I just didn't want to see it. The nurse went in and got my phone, and they're like, you need to call him now. I said, I can't call him, you call him. So I gave them the PIN for my phone. And they're like, what's his name? And I'm like, Matt Mitchell. His name's Matt Mitchell. And they're like, Kate, we can't find a Matt Mitchell on your phone. I'm like, oh, that's right. It's the sexiest guy ever. You guys have to call the sexiest guy ever. So they had to call the sexiest guy ever, who left the kids at my father-in-law's. And then Matt came up. And at this point, he was seizing quite severely and for a very long period of time. And they came out and they said the paediatrician starts in 10 minutes. The emergency doctors were there. They were like, we're working. It's all good. I was like, okay. And so then the paediatrician came. Now, the paediatrician, I can't remember his name, but he looked like Tarzan. Surfy dude, curly hair. So I just call him Tarzan because he was a bit of a knight in shining armour, this man. So he came in and they were like, you can come in and see him now. So he was breathing at this point, but he was still seizing. So his eyes were deviated to the one side, left or right. I think it's the right side. And he was screaming. So do you remember Days of Our Lives? And I think some younger listeners will not remember Days of Our Lives, but I did as a country kid. And there was the Timmy doll. Do you remember there was that crazy Timmy doll of Days of Our Lives?
I don't remember seeing a Timmy doll, but there would certainly be enough scenes in Days of Our Lives with hospital beds and and high drama.
And Timmy dolls. So this Timmy doll could talk, and it was like a little doll. And that's what Darcy reminded me of. He was like he was possessed. So he knew that it wasn't him there, and he wanted it to stop, but something was overriding his system. So his eyes were deviated and he was screaming, this blood-curdling scream. generally there was the doctor and then there was an assisting doctor that was behind him. And I remember him touching my arm and saying, he's okay. Because as a parent, you're like, what damage will this be doing to my child? And I remember thinking, what damage? So they loaded him up on some particular drugs, which would hopefully stop the seizures. But when they do that, they get really, really, really tired because obviously it's shutting down the system to kind of reboot it as such. So they stopped the screaming and they stopped the seizure. Darcy at this point was very tired, very lethargic, and he was all rubbed up in his nice warm blanket that they give them. And Tarzan turned around and he said, as lovely as they are here and as great as they are not equipped for this kind of situation.
Meaning the hospital, is that what he meant?
Yeah.
Yeah. That Albany Hospital just didn't have the capacity or the resources to be able to manage a child with this situation.
No.
Yeah.
And so he goes, we're going to fly you out. We're going to call the plane.
Yeah. Did that worry you even more, or did that give you a sense of relief?
To even put into words or to even try and help someone who's never needed comprehend how much of a relief that was is very, very hard, because to be able to express that in words, I don't think I could do it justice of the relief that I felt when they said, I think even after that first time, you would just pray that they would fly you out because you would get some answers. And then the second time you get told to go home. And then now it's just reached a point where it's so dangerous. And I often think that if I went home and I listened and I didn't follow my gut, the situation we could have found ourselves in possibly for the second time, I would hate to think, but that didn't happen. I think that we made those choices and there was a reason for that. But when they said that they were going to fly us to Perth through the RFDS, the sense of relief is just incredible. And not fear. There was no fear there. Like, obviously, you're concerned, but just that we are going to have neurologists or the best care with the best equipment with the best people on the safest journey that we possibly can. Yeah, it's just very tricky to bottle that feeling and to be able to communicate that, but the biggest sense of relief that you've ever felt in your life. And so grateful that service is there.
Did you go with Darcy, or did he have to go by himself with the specialists on board?
No, so I travelled with Darcy. So at this point, he'd slept quite a few hours before we caught our plane. And so it was always going to make it a bit iffy about how we would travel, because if he woke up. And so I remember we got taken out by ambulance to Albany Airport, and we hopped on and we had a lovely pilot named Matt, which was quite fitting. And then we had Nurse Ali and Dr. Albie. And Nurse Ali was quite incredible because, as I said, our farm was out in Narrackup, but Ali actually bought one of her dogs from Narrackup. And so she was very good at reading the room and the situation that we were in. So they'd been to Esperance and picked up an elderly lady before then, who I felt very sorry for, because at this point Darcy had found his voice again and he was not overly impressed with being on that bed in that plane.
Right.
Albie was doing what Albie needed to do. He prepped and he was telling me what would happen if X, Y, Z, with all these different things that could possibly occur. So he was just trying to pre-warn me. And I think Ali could tell that I didn't need that right now. And that's how we got the connection about the dog. But, that's 2022, and these people I met for a very short period of time, and I will never forget what they did for us. And so, we flew to Perth and we landed. Everyone was amazing. We hopped in an ambulance, and you never guess what our ambulance driver's name was.
Matt.
So that was good. We had a story of Matt, where we were taken to PCH. And it was obviously during COVID, so it was really isolating. And that's even when they said that I had to call Matt to come up. We knew that, things were not travelling as how we would have liked them to be, because it was quite isolating in terms of visitors and who could come in and out. So we went underground, went into PCH, where we stayed for over a week. So we had a lot of testing. It was like torture. pretty sure I had my first panic attack. And they're like, Kate, do not faint here because we would have to put you on a trolley and take you over to Charlie's. I was like naked in the shower. I was like, what's going on? Don't faint anyway. And that was really tricky because the kids and Matt were so far away. So Matt packed up all our things and came to Perth, and then he couldn't even come into the hospital to give me a hug or a kiss. And some of the testing that Darcy had were bloods on the hour for a period of time. And then I was breastfeeding him at the time and he wouldn't go back to sleep. So I didn't sleep for 2 days at one point.
That's really hard because hospitals at that time were just they were so isolated. They were islands and it was impossible to get in. And once you were in, you couldn't go anywhere. And it was a very, very tough time. It must have been challenging.
And I think even when they drove to Perth to get my clothes, he wasn't allowed in. He had to give my bag to the security guard, and the security guard pushed it on the floor to me. I remember having a band on, like a wristband. And then when I went downstairs, they were like, you have the wrong coloured wristband on, because obviously they did all their testing at the front of the hospital. And they're like, how did you get in? Where's your wristband? And I was like, I came underground from an ambulance, from a plane. They were like, oh, you might need to go out and then retest and change. And I was like, there is no way I'm leaving. I'm in here now. So what's the difference? Like, I'm not leaving Darcy upstairs. And so I think navigating those things, funnily enough, one of the girls that was a few years older than me at boarding school, she was in there with her daughter. And that was kind of a godsend because she did get me food from the cafe and then leave it. So I felt like there was a little bit of support that was there.
There was somebody. Now, did they finally give you a diagnosis? And was there a way forward for Darcy? Because you've now, at this point, had 3 really scary medical incidents happen. So what did they say from a doctor's and from a prognosis perspective?
Yeah, so Darcy was, he had an EEG when he was in hospital, and the original findings of that, there wasn't as much there as what we thought. However, there was some variance in one side of his brain. So Darcy was diagnosed with epilepsy. And then we were in hospital. We spoke to the pharmacist, which was amazing. So he's medicated, and he's still medicated twice a day on anti-epileptic drug. So he has that at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. At this point, we were given the drug and told that if something else was happening when he was medicated, that there could be something more going on. He hadn't had an MRI in this point in time. And so we got discharged after a week. We made the decision. We stayed at Ronald McDonald House for another 2 nights. And then we stayed just under another week in Perth for our own well-being, just so we felt secure and safe before we made the drive home. Yeah, so he had the diagnosis of epilepsy. If anything else was going to occur while he was medicated, then more testing would occur. After the 2 weeks of in Perth, we then drove back to the farm in Narrackup, which was very isolating. And I think that's when all the questions start to hit and you start reflecting on what had happened, the journey that you had been on, and how you empower yourself with education, really.
From that point forward, so we're talking 2022 and we're now in 2025. Have you relocated off the farm, or do you still have the farm and still go backwards and forwards?
Even though, so with that original diagnosis of epilepsy, even on the medication when we got home for the next 1.5 years, it was still really, really rough. So it was just trying to get that mix and the balance right. He was still having different types of seizures that we were trying to manage. There was one day that he'd been quite unwell and we went to Denmark to the tavern for a lunch with some friends from Perth, and he had a seizure, went to the hospital there. They said, you're good. I said, yep. So we left and we came into Albany where he had another one. He had 2 in one day. And for me, that was the time that I called it, because we were not close to town. It was quite stressful. They were very unpredictable. We didn't know what the future was going to hold. So it was pretty much weekly, if not every 2 weeks, that we were in hospital for minimum 3 days.
Wow.
So we were traveling those distances, generally not prepared, unfair on the big 2 kids. I was never at home really. If I was in the hospital, there was a lot of travel to and fro. And so we made the decision to sell the farm, which on reflection was a huge call. But for us, the kids' safety, or Darcy's safety and well-being, was our priority. And we were very fortunate enough that we had other things that we could rely on. Still, Darcy asked to go home. So he is 4. He goes to kindy. he talks about the farm daily and he asks to go home, which is very hard. And you feel like you've had something stolen from you. So something that's ingrained in the year 7 yearbook. I always wanted to be a farmer like my dad and my grandpa, and the kids love it. And it was taken from us.
Yeah. Sorry, I can see that's really upsetting. Yeah, I know you'd said earlier it was like your forever home, and so for you it was a hard choice, and it's a loss. It'll be a loss for a long time.
But yeah, his safety and the kids' well-being was a priority. And at that point in time, we didn't know what was going to happen. So he did have MRIs. They found 3 abnormalities. Whether they're true abnormalities or not, we're not sure.
Mm.
All good things can come to those who wait. So he hasn't had a seizure now for nearly a year and a half. So come August, they will wean Darcy off his epilepsy meds and see what happens. So that's exciting. And although we're in town, we've just sold our house and there is 16 acres close to town that hopefully we can acquire and the kids
There
can
you
have their
go.
pets.
There you go. They can be motorbikes and they can be all sorts of things.
Yeah, cows. And yeah, Grace was saying she wants goats. So I think, from something that's been so challenging, there's been a lot of good, and we've been able to create a really lovely community that supports us and belong to a community that's able to make a difference. And telling our story and sharing our story helps others that are in similar situations. So although, there's been a lot of heartache, there's also been some incredible highs to this whole ride.
I did an interview late last year with a lovely woman in Queensland, and she had a child within her brood who had a series of medical issues, and she was from rural Queensland, and she ended up spending a lot of time in hospital. And she created an organisation to help people who are feeling lost in the city because they're so far from home and not really knowing the system, not knowing who to speak to or how to connect up with local housing and all that sort of stuff. And so she created a charitable organisation called Friendly Faces Helping Hands. And I was struck that when I was coming to learn that I was going to be interviewing you, you have done a similar thing on the West Coast. Would you tell me about the Darcy Effect and what that is, and what is your vision, and how do you use the experience that you've had with Darcy to help others?
Yeah, so the Darcy Effect was started in a way to keep sane during all those hospital visits. And I think that if you can't pick up, I love a chat, and there was no one that wanted to chat with me. So I kind of, when I teach, live by feel it, think it, flip it. So I kind of had to put into action my own little motto that I give the kids. So I had to feel those emotions that I was having, which were so varied. I then had to think about what I was going to do with them and flip the negative into a positive.
Mm.
And that's how we came up with the Darcy effect. So the epilepsy affects Darcy first and foremost, and then it snowballs and it affects everybody else. But what could we do as a family to have a positive impact on our community and have a snowball effect? So when we went on the RFDS plane during COVID, I had nothing. So I didn't have any toiletries, toothbrush, toothpaste, toys, nothing. And so we've actually sent out over 1,000 hospital bags to regional, rural and remote hospitals across Australia, predominantly here in WA. We've hit almost every hospital, if not once, some 3 times. And that includes clothing as well. So when the kids come in from particular really remote areas and they need some clean clothes and what have you, they can go on the RFDS plane with a bag that helps them and some goodies. And, there's been incredible stories from all across WA that they message you on the RFDS plane because their kids swallowed a 20-cent piece, to dog attacks, to all varying things. Grown men with a staph infection crying when he got his bag because he wanted to have a shower. So there's just all of those little goodies in there that, although seem really, really small, can have a huge impact when you're having a really bad day. From that same thing, working with Pia from Perth Kids Hub to create an online directory where parents can access support for various medical things. But the project that I think that's been the biggest driver for me and that I'm extremely proud of is when this all happened, the amount of people that asked me how I knew what to do was mind-boggling. And you and I both know that first aid is so imperative and that first responder. And education being my background, there's not much stuff that is made for our kids specifically. And so using my health and phys ed degree and working with incredible, talented creatives from across Australia, including regional, rural and remote. Our illustrator, Kate Rudder, is from over your way, and also Beck Bignell from over here. We're able to make a pilot animation called Fangs on the Farm. So it's a 9-minute pilot animation about snake bite first aid. And it's put in a way that is relevant and relatable for our country kids. And it's easy access. It's equal access. Every kid, every family, every grandparent can access this story and hopefully learn something that we don't want them to have to use, but they might find it handy one day. Yeah.
We'll put the link for that YouTube animation into the show notes so that people can easily find it. And we'll also put the link for your website for Darcy Effect so they can find that as well and can contribute or participate or help in some way if they wish to. And if they're somebody who is a regional or rural or remote person that has found themselves in a hospital and wanting one of your packs or bags, is there somebody they should speak to, or what do they do?
Yeah, they can just make an inquiry online and then just put the hospital or where you would like them sent, and then I can make them and then I post them out with the kids with my little merry men. Like, Darcy, how many hairbrushes have we put in that bag, mate? But I think it's a great way for the kids to give back to the community as well. So there was this a school that I worked at, Great Southern Grammar boarding school here in the Great Southern, and the kids really relate to the story, not because I taught them or they know Darcy, but because being in hospital is sometimes like being in boarding school, like you're away from your community and your surroundings. And it was really interesting to hear their take on why they're so passionate about helping. And I thought that it was actually really cool that they could navigate that and put that into words.
That's amazing. It's been so lovely chatting with you. You're very, very impressive. And my heart goes out to you, honestly, to you and to Darcy and to Harry, to Gracie, to Matt, to all of them, and even to the bowls and the ongoing competitions. You're full of heart. It's a family full of heart. It's just wonderful. You've managed to grapple and get control of something that's really shaken the very foundations of your family. It's just really impressive where you've come from and where you're going. So I just want to say thank you for all you're doing. And I'm really honoured that we at the RFDS could come and help you on that day and get Darcy off to hospital. And we'll do it again in a flash if we need to, but hopefully that won't happen.
Thank you so much for having me and allowing me to share my story, but also just chatting, having a chat. So thank you.
Hey, thank you for listening to this episode. And thanks again to our major sponsor and major national partner, Isuzu Ute Australia. Isuzu Ute is committed to supporting the communities in which the RFDS operates. To learn more, search Isuzu Ute online.
Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with family and friends and subscribe and follow, and then you'll never miss the next adventure. For all the details on how you can share your story with us, join our Facebook group and donate to the Royal Flying Doctor Service. Check out the show notes for details. The Flying Doctor podcast is recorded on Ngunnawal land. It's produced by Sophie Campbell, edited by Mandy Coolin, and I'm your host, Lana Howarth. Catch you next time.